This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Yep. Okay. Rather than every once a week is in the policy for these vessels now. Hi everyone and welcome back to today's episode of Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Georgie.
And I'm Alice.
In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the coroner's report into the death of Ryan Harry Donoghue. Ryan was 20 years old at the time of his death, which occurred while he was working on a prawn trawler in November of 2013. Ryan was born in the UK and moved to Australia with his family when he was 6. He left mainstream school in year 8 and from then on he attended specialist schools to learn mechanics.
Sure. Okay. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
All right.
When Ryan was 19, he was shark fishing in the Bass Strait when he was asked by someone, it's not clear who, whether he would be interested in working on a prawn trawler in the NT.
Sure.
It's random.
Yeah.
But apparently it's what happened. And he obviously said yes to that. So in June 2013, he was flown to Cairns by his new employer to be a member of the crew on the fishing vessel New Fish 1. The New Fish 1 was a 22.8 metre prawn trawler which was built in Spain in 1983. Ryan assisted setting up the boat before heading out to sea on the 28th of July 2013. The plan was to spend 16 to 18 weeks trawling for prawns in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which I think we've talked about this in another episode. It's the area between the peak of Queensland and the peak of Northern Territory.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of little dip in there. On board on this prawn trawler, there was a skipper, an engineer, a mate, and a cook, as well as Ryan, who was the deckhand. In September, the mate left and they were joined by another deckhand.
What's the difference between a mate and a deckhand?
I don't know.
Okay, cool.
Maybe the mate is more experienced
I think so.
on
Well,
boats. Because that's like you got the skipper and then the first mate.
A deckhand is a labourer on a ship, does manual jobs, etc., under the direction of the mate.
okay, so
Yeah.
mate is more
It's
senior
like a
than
manager.
deckhand.
Mate is a professional seafarer responsible for navigation and ensuring the vessel is loaded correctly.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, they have to, be aware of the ship's stability and the load that's on board and all that kind of stuff.
So it sounds like you want to keep one of those on board.
Yes.
Because the mate left and then they replaced him with a deckhand.
Yeah.
They did, but then Ryan got promoted to first mate.
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool. So
yeah.
Ryan probably has the skills anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
So Ryan loved the work. He had the option each fortnight to go home with the mothership that tended the trawlers, but he never did. He was promoted to first mate, as I just said, and was very excited by this. He told his family that he dreamt of being the skipper of his own boat one day.
Cool.
On the 28th of November 2013, the New Fish 1 was fishing off of Bremer Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria. The next morning, it headed back in the direction of Cairns. So Ryan and the deckhand were tasked to pack up the boat. Ryan was dressed in shorts and a singlet with no shoes.
But that'd be normal for a boat, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Sure.
not for the tasks that they were doing, but
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I feel like shoes might be helpful.
yeah. During the afternoon, Ryan and the deckhand were unshackling the nets. Conditions were cloudy and the water was choppy. Some of the shackles connecting the nets to the outer boards were rusted and had seized. Ryan reported to the skipper that the deckhand was using the angle grinder to cut the seized and rusted shackles, and he had wrapped the angle grinder in a plastic bag in an attempt to waterproof it.
Oh, no.
Wait. What?
That's not quite how that should work.
No.
I have so many questions. Which bit did they wrap? Just the
I
electric
don't-
bit?
it doesn't say.
You can't
It
use
just-
an angle grinder if it's wrapped in a plastic
Yeah, I'm
bag.
guessing
No.
they wrapped it around like the handle.
They
and
must be.
Is it plugged in or
Yes,
does
it
have a
must
battery?
be.
It is electric,
Okay.
plugged in.
Yeah.
So the skipper said not to bother trying to waterproof it as it's not possible. So it should just not be used around water.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like a don't bother waterproofing it, go ahead. It
Yeah.
was like, please stop using that thing that's not waterproof.
Yeah, it's,
Okay.
it's just don't try and wrap it in a plastic bag. Just don't use it around water.
Yeah.
So at about 6 p.m, Ryan was then using the angle grinder to cut the shackles. As he was doing so, the deckhand was holding the power lead above the deck to keep it away from the water.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Ryan was bending down to cut some of the lower shackles when a wave washed over the deck, engulfing him in the grinder.
Oh, no.
Ryan was electrocuted and fell backwards onto the deck. When the deckhand realised what was happening, he pulled the extension lead from the grinder, which stopped the current. Ryan got onto his hands and knees and tried to get up, but stumbled and collapsed. He was otherwise non-responsive and had a blank stare.
It's not often that I go on a boat thinking I'm going to get electrocuted.
No.
Yeah.
So the deckhand called for the skipper. The skipper then called for the engineer and the cook, and they started CPR, which both the skipper and the engineer were trained in.
Oh, okay, cool.
They called the head company, who contacted an intensive care physician working for Careflight in Darwin, who then called the vessel to provide instructions. Ryan's breathing would stop and then start again. However, it wasn't long before he stopped taking any breaths. At that point, the New Fish 1 was 11 hours from the nearest port.
Oh, that's so far away.
Yeah, so it's not close at all.
Quite literally in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
And you could get a helicopter, but then...
It's still going to take a
Still
long
going to
time
take
for
a
a
while
helicopter.
to
Yeah.
get everyone together and
Yeah.
actually get out there. During the CPR, the intensive care specialist asked whether a defibrillator or EpiPen were on the vessel. They had neither, which is not fantastic.
Yeah.
How big's this boat again? It's only got like four
It's
or
got
five
like five
people on it.
People on it, yeah.
So it's not a huge boat.
No.
And 2013?
Yes.
Yeah, so I feel like it wasn't as prominent then.
No, that is true. So CPR continued for approximately 75 minutes, but at 7:19 p.m, the doctor told the crew to stop their efforts. At that point, the New Fish 1 redirected to Gove in the Northern Territory to meet with the NT police. Ryan's body was taken from the vessel and flown to the Royal Darwin Hospital, and police took statements from all on board and seized the grinder and the power cord. The New Fish 1 returned to Cairns, where it was inspected by Maritime Safety Queensland officers and senior electrical safety inspectors. The inspection found that the general purpose socket, or GPO, that the grinder had been plugged into the deck was not protected by a safety switch, known as a residual current device, or RCD.
Which is... Was that the things that, like, way back was the holy cow issue as well? Yeah, okay.
They didn't have that because it was an old building.
Yeah, so this is an 80s boat, right?
Yeah,
So similar concept.
Same thing.
Yeah.
So RCDs are recognised as providing additional protection in areas where excessive earth leakage current in the event of failure of other measures of protection or carelessness by users could present a significant risk of electric shock. They're
Seems fair.
designed to operate or trip a switch before a current may cause the fibrillation of a human heart.
As the wave washed over him, you would want it to have like immediately
It
cut
switched
out,
off,
but
yeah.
instead it continued to provide the electric current.
Until the deckhand.
And it would have been so unsafe for the deckhand because
Yeah.
he potentially could have also become electrocuted in that process.
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah. But obviously the deckhand wasn't thinking about that.
Oh,
You
yeah.
kind of just
Oh,
like,
yeah, you just-
yeah.
Don't get me wrong, you know, it's an automatic response, but it could have killed him as well.
Absolutely. So there were two newer GPOs on the deck of the New Fish 1 that were protected with an RCD. The unprotected GPO used by Ryan and the deckhand was the only unprotected one on the vessel.
Oh, how unlucky.
Yeah. The reason for this was subject to much speculation and various evidence and varying evidence from different people who were called in the inquest as well, rather than why he was using that particular one, because I don't think he would have known whether it had an RCD on it or not. In 2009, an electrician had recommended that RCDs be fitted to the New Fish 1. So obviously prior to that, there were no RCDs.
Okay, so it was only
On
in
the vessel.
2009 that they got fitted. Okay.
Correct. The evidence given was that the electrician and his employer then went and installed the RCDs to the entire fleet of fishing vessels that the New Fish 1 was part of. There were 9 total vessels in this particular fleet. However, it is clear that RCDs were not installed to the GPO that was used by Ryan.
So they just missed one.
But did they miss one or did they miss several across the whole fleet?
We'll find out.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, surely they went through the whole fleet and
Yes.
double-checked. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Ryan's death is not the first death of this type. Not a freak accident. In fact, his death was very similar to the death of Bradley Howard Thomas, who died on a fishing trawler offshore from Carnarvon, WA, in March 2000. Mr. Thomas was on the deck of the fishing vessel, the Cape Grafton II, attempting to grind part of the stabiliser fin with a portable electric angle grinder. He was wearing shorts, a t-shirt, sunglasses and thongs. He was bending down grinding when waves came over the deck and he was found by crew members lying on his stomach unconscious. A crew member disconnected the lead from the power outlet and CPR commenced and continued for 3 hours until Mr. Thomas was pronounced dead.
Wow.
So yeah, but pretty much exactly the same.
Yeah. And again, I wouldn't have thought that there was a high proportion of deaths of people on boats using electrical equipment.
You wouldn't think so, but then again, it's on water and they have to use electrical equipment.
Yeah,
and they're
yeah,
on
I just-
water, and you know, waves can be unpredictable. You think it's still and then
all of a sudden a wave comes. So I'm
over.
like, yeah, wouldn't you just wait until it's calmer ocean or whatever? But I guess when you've got to get a job done,
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you're packing up and you're wanting to go back to shore.
you can't find a calmer point until, that job gets fixed or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. So a coroner's inquest was held into Mr. Thomas's death in September 2001. It was found that the primary factors contributing to his death were the use of an electric tool and extension lead in an environment highly exposed to seawater, lack of foresight in assessing risks when the grinder was first introduced on the vessel, the absence of an RCD for the grinder and lead, noting the use of RCD at a workplace is mandatory under the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations Act, and the use of thongs as footwear.
Because if he had better shoes, he wouldn't have absorbed an electrical current. Is that
I
the
think
premise?
that's right. Like
Okay.
if you're wearing like proper boots, it sort of
Because, if you're standing in water,
Yeah.
you're not actually
you're not
conducting.
creating the circuit, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah. Whereas Mr. Thomas was wearing thongs and then Ryan was not wearing any footwear.
Footwear. So either way, both were not safe.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. To stop that electric current. So in that report, the coroner concluded that the death of Mr. Thomas was tragic, unnecessary and avoidable. And he made 9 recommendations, including alternatives to electricity be investigated as a means to power tools in vessels that are out at sea. So, for example, compressed air could be appropriate.
But that was in WA. And does this
Correct.
become a state-based problem where, that didn't actually apply to anyone outside of WA?
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah, so it'll become very apparent the jurisdictional issues
Here.
in this matter
okay.
going forward. Obviously, Mr. Thomas's death occurred in WA, so a lot of the recommendations there were made in the WA context, and then there were issues about the jurisdiction of where this death actually occurred because it occurred
In
out
open water,
in
right?
the sea, but like kind of between Queensland and Northern Territory. But we'll get into that a little bit more.
But it was officially handled by Northern Territory?
You would think, but it wasn't. No.
Oh, it was put through the Queensland Coroner's
It
Court.
was like in terms of the workplace health and safety investigation was done by Queensland, but this coroner's report is an NT coroner's report.
Oh.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
very bizarre. We will get into it.
Okay,
the
yeah.
jurisdictional issues are very strange.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, back onto the recommendations from Mr. Thomas's coroner's inquest. So another recommendation was maintenance carried out on an electricity or electric power tools on a vessel should be done when the vessel is anchored or in calm waters.
But again, easier said than done.
That's, exactly.
Because if it's preventing you from moving where you are. Or
they're sort of saying that whatever the shackles were seized or whatever, so they needed to get them loose to actually pack up the boat.
Yeah,
then
yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
well, you kind of need to do that in order to move.
Yeah.
But where applicable, if that can be done. If electrical power tools are required, the operator and supervisor should be wearing suitable protective clothing, including rubber boots and gloves. If electrical leads are connected to electric power tools, they should be fixed at a high position above the deck to minimise the risk of contact with water. Any work involving the use of electric power tools carried out at sea should not be carried out by an unsupervised person.
I mean, Ryan was being supervised. His mate was holding up the cord out of the water for him.
But I mean, supervised by someone maybe more senior than him,
Yeah.
more junior. And in, obviously, Mr. Thomas's case, he wasn't
was-
incapacitated
yeah,
at all
yeah,
because
so-
he was just found on the deck.
Yeah, true.
unconscious.
That time between the electrical current and people finding him could be significant.
Could have been. Yeah, we just don't know. Another recommendation was that the Department of Transport and WorkSafe coordinate a regular pre-season inspection of all fishing vessels throughout the state, with an emphasis on inspection of all electrical systems, including RCDs and portable electric tools. So again, it was only sort of WA-wide.
Yeah.
All crew on vessels to receive training on the use of electrical power tools while at sea, and that appropriate protective clothing be provided on all vessels for the use of any equipment provided.
Yeah, and sorry, did either of them have gloves on? Because we talked about the footwear. Okay, so neither of them had gloves either.
No, they were
Yeah.
just sort of in like singlet, shorts.
That's right, yeah, you mentioned.
and footwear. Yeah. And one of them was wearing sunglasses.
Did the sunglasses help?
Oh, I doubt they would have.
I don't think so, but potentially assisting in eye protection.
True. Yeah, I suppose they had some sort of attempt at eyewear on.
Yeah, that's it. So the coroner in Ryan's inquest set out these recommendations made in Mr. Thomas's inquest in full and noted it would become so patently obvious that Ryan would be alive today had those recommendations been followed, even in part.
That must be so frustrating for coroners.
Yeah.
Like, when they come across ones like this. I've definitely read where the coroner's just like, ugh, we've been through this.
Yeah, no. At least with this one, it's a different coroner in a different jurisdiction. But when you read them and it's the same coroner in the same jurisdiction, or at least just the same jurisdiction, you're like, oh,
yeah,
that'd be so frustrating.
Yeah.
So in Mr. Thomas's inquest, the coroner noted that other options for high-powered electric tools should be sourced for vessels at sea, which could include cordless power tools, low-voltage tools, and compressed air-powered tools.
Yeah, cool.
Despite this recommendation, a 240-volt angle grinder was on the New Fish 1, and there was no restriction on how the angle grinder could be used at sea at all.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like there was a work instruction or anything.
Yeah, they're not saying
this.
you can only use this like inside.
Yeah.
So the New Fish 1 did have a safety management system which was introduced in 2011 in response to a notification from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority that they would be required from July 2016 in order for a vessel to operate in Australian waters. The purpose of the safety management system is to eliminate or to control to acceptable levels the risk associated with the nature of activity conducted by a vessel. So there's a standard form for the system which each vessel can use, and nowhere in that standard form were there procedures or instructions relating to the use of electric power tools on vessels.
Which it sounds like are commonly used on these vessels.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, okay.
That said, the company that owned New Fish 1 used a risk assessment and control form for its vessels. The issue date for the form was July 2011, and it identified the use of electric equipment as a hazardous task. These hazards were stated as water and moisture, and the existing controls recorded were isolation switches, engineering inspections, electrical safety policy. However, there was no electrical safety policy.
Excellent.
So,
To be determined.
exactly. So it was like, okay, the existing controls are isolation switches, so RCDs,
which they thought
we thought we'd done,
had,
but they hadn't. Engineering inspections. Associated risks were stated as electric shock and electrocution, with the risk rating said to be high.
Yes.
Due to the high risk rating, it was noted that the activity can only proceed provided that the risk level has been reduced to as low as reasonably practical. The controls must include those identified in legislation, standards, and codes of practice. The risk assessment must have been reviewed and approved by a supervisor, and the supervisor must review the document and effectiveness of the implemented risk controls. The coroner concluded that the parent company did not follow its own safety management system as it failed to reduce the risk of electrocution to as low as reasonably practical or at all, as well as failing to use the risk controls identified in legislation, which we'll go through a little bit more a bit later.
Well, yeah, it's kind of their risk thing said, it's got to be identified by legislation, but then they've not really listed that. And are people just like on top of that? Like,
No, they're not.
exactly.
No.
So like if your supervisor's coming out being like, hang on, I just got to quickly double check the legislation.
Yeah. And I don't think they're going to have all the legislation on board the vessel.
Exactly,
And I don't know
yeah.
how prevalent Google is.
In
or
2013.
Internet.
When they're 11 hours off of the coast of Australia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So not like pulling out his big legislation booklet and rifling through it.
It seems weird to me that they've not, like, I don't know, taken out sections of the legislation, like snippets in that or something, or given some sort of overarching generalized information there.
The issue is, again, and we'll get into it, is there's so many different relevant legislation and
fair, because it depends on where they are.
Standards, exactly, because they're fishing vessels, they're not restricted to one jurisdiction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it gets a little bit messy. Since 1996, it has been required by Northern Territory law that non-portable RCDs be installed into the switchboard or fixed electrical power sockets for all workplaces. Vessels are considered workplaces.
Yes.
The new fish one was in the Gulf of Carpentaria when Ryan was electrocuted and died, which is within the jurisdiction of the anti-workplace legislation by reason of the Crimes at Sea Act 2000.
Sure.
Crimes at Sea Act. That sounds fun.
Crimes at Sea. The coroner noted that the important parts of the workplace health and safety legislation applicable include that a person conducting a business must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the health and safety of work is engaged by the person while the workers are at work in the business. A person conducting a business or undertaking must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that the provision and maintenance of a work environment without risk to health, the provision and maintenance of safe systems of work, and the provision of any information, training, or instruction necessary to protect all persons from risk to health and safety. So basically, they've got a general duty of care to ensure that the workers on board or the workers at their workplace are safe.
I appreciate that of an employer.
Which is funny because a little while ago, maybe last time, we were talking about how annoying it is with plugging in
Test and tags.
and like, you know, not being able to use your own cable to charge your phone at work. But the reality is your workplace has a duty of care to ensure that you're safe at all times. And if they deem that that's not safe, then they've got a responsibility to you, and there's potentially legal ramifications if they don't do it. So as frustrating as it is.
Yeah.
Anyway. So the maximum penalty for the breaches of those provisions that relate to a workplace's duty of care are $300,000 or 5 years imprisonment or both for an individual, and $600,000 or 5 years imprisonment or both for an individual that's conducting a business, or $3 million for an offence by a body corporate. So not insignificant penalties.
Yeah.
So the coroner remarked that at the time of Ryan's death, relevant legislation had been in place for over a decade, and that it's difficult to understand how workplaces were still non-compliant in fitting such basic, inexpensive safety devices. Evidence in the inquest suggested RCDs cost less than $20 and electricians charge around $150 to install them. I think the issue here is they thought
that they
were all installed, but that wasn't the case.
But the coroner seems grumpy.
The coroner was very grumpy, and we'll talk a little bit more about why. So evidence before the WA coroner was that Mr. Thomas may have survived the electric shock had he been wearing appropriate clothing, yet Ryan was also wearing inappropriate clothing.
Yeah.
Some 13 years later.
Yeah.
The skipper of the vessel noted crew received training on the use of personal protective equipment, or PPE. When on deck, they're supposed to wear boots, gloves, and aprons, as written in their standard procedures. He said Ryan and the deckhand were pretty good at wearing PPE. However, he didn't notice that Ryan was not wearing it the day he was packing up the boat. The coroner noted that it was unlikely that a young man, after 4 months of learning on the job at sea, would, against training and supervision, be out of PPE unless it was the norm on the boat. Not to be wearing it. So basically he's saying he hadn't worked there that long. So at the time of Ryan's death, the New Fish One had a significant safety management system which required all crew to sign off on the aspects which they had been trained. None of the training related to the use of portable power tools, though. The induction manual required all crew to sign that they would read it before setting sail, which is bizarre. It's like, okay, sign it to say that you will read it, and then that's good enough.
What?
Just get around to it at some point.
That's what it says. The induction manual required all crew to sign that they would read the induction manual before setting sail.
Okay.
So rather than signing it after
you've actually read it.
And to say that you've read it.
I will read it before we set sail.
Okay, and what is that? Like they sign that as they're stepping onto the boat? Like,
That's all it said.
all right.
Under the heading of electrical installation, it said all portable electrical equipment on deck shall be regularly inspected. Power leads at deck level shall be secured from exposure to water. That was the extent of the safety guidance.
Right.
Some of these things sound like common sense to me. So does this even need to be written down? But like clearly, yes.
Clearly it does. And also just to protect themselves.
Yeah,
To
true.
be like, this was written down and you didn't follow it.
But I mean, the supervisor did tell them to stop doing that earlier in the day, didn't they? Or the day
they
before?
told to stop trying to waterproof
True.
the angle grinder
And
with a plastic
stop
bag.
using the angle grinder.
Yeah.
Just don't try and waterproof it. Just don't use it around water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the coroner noted that the angle grinder Ryan was holding was plugged into the socket next to the deck store and the deckhand held the lead above the deck to keep it out of water. Therefore, they followed the procedure that was required and provided to them.
That portion of it, but it didn't follow the PPE portion of their requirement.
That's true. But they're talking about just the use of the angle grinder at this point.
Yeah, fair.
At the time, Ryan and the deckhand were packing up the boat. There was no one supervising them. Apparently, this was the first time that either Ryan or the deckhand had packed up the boat. They had been given instructions on how to do so, including that the job was dangerous. The exact words could not be recalled. However, the coroner found that it was unlikely that only 90 minutes later the young men would be acting so contrary to instructions that it was unlikely that the tone of the instructions in terms of them, the task being very dangerous was that strong.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically saying, like, it's very rare that, if you were talking and giving those really, like, detailed instructions about how dangerous this is, that then they would then 90 minutes later be doing something completely different.
Yeah, no shoes.
Yeah, exactly.
Happy days, yeah, right.
Exactly. The coroner found that it was unlikely that the expectations around the use of the angle grinder were adequately communicated to Ryan and the deckhand.
Was there any information around like time pressure? Were like they trying to get this done because they needed to leave or move or anything like that?
No, there was no
Yeah, okay.
sort of talk about any of that. Interestingly, so the deckhand at the time of the inquest was actually out at sea, so they couldn't actually call him for evidence.
Oh.
So in terms of the instructions and things that were given,
we don't know because
we don't know
have that.
exactly what was talked about.
Well, we have one side of it.
We have
the
one
supervisor.
the supervisor side,
yeah.
but don't actually know what was conveyed
from the deckhand
from
perspective.
the deckhand perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, because he was
And they didn't
unavailable.
provide any written statement
No.
even? Interesting.
No, and
Yeah,
all it
right.
said in the report was he was out at sea and unavailable. And I understand that obviously they're out at sea for extended periods of time. But yeah. So the owner of the fishing vessel company conceded that the workplace was unsafe during cross-examination. Specifically, he conceded that the absence of an RCD protecting the circuit to the general purpose outlet was unsafe. The owner noted that he was aware of the inquest into the death of Mr. Thomas around the time that Mr. Thomas's death occurred. He was not aware at the time of Mr. Thomas's death that RCDs were mandatory.
So they were mandatory
They were
at
mandatory
that point in
back
time?
in 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, remember,
Yeah.
I think I said 1996.
Yeah.
Onwards, they were mandatory. So
Yeah.
he wasn't aware at the time of Mr. Thomas's death that they were mandatory. But then following Mr. Thomas's death, his company began installing RCDs in their vessels, which is a little bit contrary because that inquest happened in 2001 and it sort of said before that they didn't start doing that until 2009.
It was a very long plan.
It was a long,
approach.
an 8-year plan to
Sometimes in a
install-
business, you've got to go through all of these assessments and things, and that can take a very, very long time.
Yeah, look, I mean, this guy, the owner of the company, wasn't a very good witness.
Right.
He said a lot of contrary things and the coroner was not happy with him.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was the owner's belief that the one socket which caused Ryan's death was the only one in the whole fleet that did not have an RCD. However,
Statistically seems unlikely.
yes, on reviewing statements from their electrician who did an inspection later, there were 29 RCDs that were fitted to fleet vessels following Ryan's death. So obviously those 29
Didn't exist prior. Yeah. Okay.
They didn't exist prior, although with that said, they thought that 6 of those were likely to be replacements. So
I guess that, some could malfunction or whatever.
exactly.
Yeah.
So from that's what, still 23.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Sockets.
They got fitted. How many
Yeah.
boats do they have?
9.
That's not ideal. Why would you fit to 2 but not a third? Is the other bit that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, would you not do the whole boat? Like,
You would think so, but if you've got 2 or 3 people working on the same boat simultaneously, potentially one thought the other was going to do that one. And the same thing, like...
There's only 3 sockets. Do they need more than one?
But there may be more sockets.
Yeah, there'd have to be more than 3 sockets altogether, like for a crew with 5 people.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. So, as I said before, the coroner found that the company owner was uncredible. He gave inconsistent and at times misleading evidence, specifically in relation to engaging one specific electrician to conduct an inspection and provide an electrical report on the New Fish One following Ryan's death. No report was ever produced by the company owner, and that particular electrician stated that he never conducted this inspection.
Wow. Can you perjure yourself in a coronial court?
I would assume you can, because you also have the right to not incriminate yourself.
Yeah, right. Anyway, sorry, because that is the definition of perjury, right?
You're literally saying one thing, and then it was one of those things where he was getting examined and it slowly sort of got teased out.
And he panicked, probably. Saying, it wasn't like he necessarily went in being like, I'm going to lie about this.
No, it was sort of like, I kind of forgot about that, or like I misunderstood that or whatever. Like
I intended to actually contract them, but then it never actually happened, but I thought it did because I'm the owner of a business and I assigned it to someone else or whatever. Yeah.
Or I'm misremembering that I didn't actually get around to that.
Exactly. Yeah. And now that you're like actually putting these questions to me, now I'm like, maybe I think something a little bit different maybe happened. In any case, the coroner was none too pleased with this guy.
Yeah.
The coroner found that the New Fish One was a workplace and therefore regulated by a number of codes, regulation and acts at the time of Ryan's death. Due to the number of relevant laws, the coroner noted that it's unclear whether a definitive legislative requirement existed mandating that an RCD should have been fitted, which is kind of a little bit contrary to what he said previously. But in terms of that particular act, I think he was sort of talking about the duty of care.
Yeah, okay.
Rather than an actual mandate for an RCD to be fitted.
Yeah.
This includes because there may have also been grandfathering provisions for some of the regulations whereby if a vessel was built before 2002, which the New Fish One obviously was, it was built in the 80s, that then the RCD instalment wasn't required.
Which, I really struggle with those ones where it's only when you do new things do the safety requirements become necessary.
Yeah. But then, as I said, there were other legislations that actually specifically required RCDs to be installed.
If there's legislation that requires a duty of care, then can't you argue that an RCD is your requirement anyway?
Yes, correct. And that's exactly what the coroner said. So he was sort of talking about there are a number of different legislations. Some say it's mandatory, some say it's not, some have these grandfathering.
But either way, you owe them a duty of care.
In either way, every legislation in relation to work health safety is going to have something to do with duty of care.
Yeah.
That's very, very standard. Yeah, and so the coroner came from that it's noted that best practice is to ensure all sockets are protected, particularly in the marine environment.
Yes.
Makes sense. So the coroner further noted that there'd been a failure on the regulatory authorities' part to adequately inform vessel owners and inspect to ensure compliance, noting the recommendation that was made in the Thomas inquest that the Department of Transport and WorkSafe conduct pre-season inspections of all fishing vessels. The coroner explained that the Marine Safety Domestic Commercial Vessel National Law Act 2012 provided to the Australian Maritime Safety Authority that the regulation for domestic commercial vessels throughout Australian waters. So essentially, this legislation provides for the national body to take over the standardisation and regulation of maritime safety across all Australian jurisdictions. So a vessel wouldn't need to have sort of different survey checks or standardised checks for each jurisdiction. It would just have to do it once.
Yeah, that's
under
helpful.
This one act, which is great. Well, it makes things a lot easier, I think. However, the Act does not provide the merging of maritime safety and workplace safety functions in relation to the RCDs. So basically it only extends to those sort of survey checks of maritime vessels rather than actually the requirements for RCDs to be installed.
Yeah, right.
That's still OH&S, which is
not what they're specifically responsible for. Yeah,
no,
okay.
Correct.
Sure.
So it's very confusing and convoluted, basically. And the coroner noted that there's inconsistencies between this Maritime Safety Act and the different OH&S
Helpful.
laws in the different states and territories. Obviously, or I don't know if people know, but where there are inconsistencies between state and Commonwealth laws, the Commonwealth law always prevails.
Yeah, which can be frustrating when the Commonwealth law is older than the state one and the state one's been updated to a best practice or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And yeah, the coroner also noted that there was nothing sort of in the Maritime Safety Act to preclude the Australian Maritime Safety Authority from still regulating gas and electricity. It just wasn't actually in there that it had to do it, but there's nothing saying that it couldn't either. All very convoluted.
And so at that point, it looks like a bit more nitpicking of like, okay, well, you never said anything about it.
No,
but you couldn't not.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like, but it wasn't really in your purview.
Yeah.
Probably not, because it's not actually outlined in the legislation. Anyway, despite these inconsistencies in legislation, it was the coroner's view that as workplaces, all domestic fishing vessels are required by law to have RCDs fitted either by a specific requirement of the state or territory workplace legislation or by the duty of care legislation for owners to provide a safe work environment for their employees. So basically, as you said before, Georgie, you got to install them because you've got a duty of care to your employees. However, the maritime safety regulators in the NT and Queensland estimated that 80% of commercial fishing vessels do not have RCDs fitted, which is insane.
For a $20 object or installation that requires an electrician for a couple of hours.
$500 maybe tops.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And at least do it in the high-risk areas. But,
it does make a lot of sense to me. And they must know the dangers. Like, owners must know the dangers associated with this.
And don't get me wrong, like, the RCD doesn't fix all of it. He still would have got electrocuted.
Yes.
So, like, there's a whole bunch of other things that needed to also be considered.
He needed to have worn proper shoes.
Yeah.
He needed to have not used an electrical tool.
In water.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he didn't go out and set out to do that, to be fair.
No, he didn't, but he's in choppy waters.
But they knew it was bad enough that they needed to hold the cord up to reduce the risk of water exposure.
Well, they had to do that according to the procedure anyway.
True. But
so
it sounds like
the one procedure that they had was to hold the cord up.
But how educated were they on that procedure? Or was that just like dumb luck?
I think that was just dumb luck that they were.
It seems to me like they had enough insight into the fact that it was dangerous enough because they were holding it out of water.
And because they were trying to waterproof it with the plastic.
Yeah, well, true. That too.
And then the skipper just says, don't use it by water.
Yeah, fair. But
and they still used it by water.
Yeah, they still elected to then press on. The RCD does sound very logical, but it wouldn't have.
It would also
100%.
In this case, no, but like in other cases of things going wrong, potentially yes.
Oh, and he might not, like, because he had a sustained electrocution, he would have then otherwise had a non-sustained electrocution. So, like, it may have made a difference because he may have been revivable.
Yeah.
I would assume the shorter you get electrocuted, the higher your chance of living.
I think so. Well, that's
I assume that's
how
what the RCD works, right?
The process of electric chairs work, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is a comparison, yes. 80% is a fair number.
It is. It's actually astonishing.
Yeah, that's concerning.
And the coroner noted that this is both a failure on the part of the owners and operators of those vessels, but also the regulators at that point.
Yes, absolutely. Because, like, the regulators, are they not checking?
Obviously not.
The failure by regulators to ensure compliance, coupled with the fact that at the time of this report, no enforcement action had been taken or recommended in relation to Ryan's death, was something that the coroner sort of found as a complete failure. There has been some back and forth there had been at the time, some back and forth between which workplace regulator, Queensland or Northern Territory, had jurisdiction over this incident. So it was eventually determined in favour of Queensland, which the coroner found was incorrect. But
excellent.
Work Health and Safety Queensland determined that apart from some administrative breaches, there had been no substantial failure by the employer and decided to take no further action.
Huh? Okay.
WHS Queensland, that was their findings.
Okay.
The Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads also conducted an investigation but found that the application of the workplace safety legislation was outside the scope of its investigation. Its investigations found that possible offences had been committed, but that the new Fish 1 was outside the Queensland jurisdiction at the time. In particular, it noted that had the incident occurred in Queensland, the socket would have had to be protected by an RCD, which would have had to be tested for correct operation at the time of intervals outlined in the relevant safety standard. Possible offences under the Maritime Safety Act were referred by the Department of Transport to the Office of Legal Counsel and the Australian Maritime Safety Authority Domestic Vessel Division for further analysis. The relevant sections refer to the duty of care of the vessel owner to provide a safe workplace. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority took no compliance or enforcement action as a result of this referral.
I am so confused.
Yes.
I don't... How did workplace... He had a duty of care. Workplace health and safety. I can understand maritime being like, okay, it wasn't technically our responsibility because it was a work health and safety responsibility.
No, that was the Department of Main Roads that said it's not technically within our legislation, but they were the ones who then referred it to the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, being like, we think there's a potential breach.
Didn't the work health and safety determine there was no breach?
They just said, nah, there's nothing there.
Yeah, like, so I can understand the maritime saying that there's no breach. I cannot understand the workplace health and safety saying that there's no breach. Anyway.
It's bizarre. And it didn't go into the investigation at all.
Oh, yeah,
that's just the sort of finding. WorkSafe NT did not investigate or pursue charges, likely because they thought it had no jurisdiction to do so, because they had this little battle at the start between Queensland and
I can
NT.
understand that if it's been done by one, you shouldn't replicate it by the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what's that going to achieve other than I'm not convinced that the answer was correct?
Well, the problem here is that one body, albeit not the work health and safety body or the workplace safety body in Queensland, is saying, hey, there's a potential breach here. It's just not in Queensland's jurisdiction. And that's why they referred it to the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, which again, remember, is that Australia-wide.
Yeah.
And they didn't do anything about it.
Cool.
Yeah. So Ryan's family sought legal advice in relation to the jurisdictional issues, and their barristers were of the opinion that the Northern Territory was the correct jurisdiction.
So helpful. At which point the Northern Territory like, nah, we're out.
Yeah. Well, they're like, we were told that it wasn't our jurisdiction,
no
so we didn't do anything when we let the Queensland
deal with it.
Authorities deal with it, but they didn't deal with it.
And now you're telling us.
And now you're telling it that it's our problem.
And so did they ever accept it as their issue?
Kind of.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, they took on board what was sort of said in this inquest.
Oh, good.
So after Ryan's death, the company did make significant changes. It made sure all vessels' electrical systems were compliant with the law.
Excellent.
Good start.
It also replaced all 240-volt electrical tools with battery-powered tools.
Yeah, nice.
It also introduced an electrical safety policy and use of electrical hand tools policy, which was incorporated into their safety management system. Only the engineer is permitted to use the mains power's electrical tools and only with the permission of the master.
On a side note, though, that must be so tedious because it's like, cool, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm the only one who can use the power tools.
Yeah, no, it's a bit much. If used, all mains-powered electrical power tools must be first connected to an RCD protected power board that in turn is plugged into the GPO. RCDs are to be tested weekly and recorded in the engineer's logbook.
Weekly seems excessive.
Yeah.
Plug sockets and extension leads to be tested fortnightly and recorded in the engineer's logbook. Only the engineer can remove an electrical tool from the storeroom. All removals are to be recorded by the master.
Sure. Okay, now it seems like they've gone a little bit the wrong direction.
It's a little bit too much.
There's a lot of admin going on right now.
Yeah.
Where possible, manual bolt cutters, wire cutters, or oxyacetylene tools are to be used, and the master will not approve the use of electric power tools on exposed deck unless absolutely necessary and conditions are suitable. Electrical equipment is not to be used without PPE, including earmuffs, rubber gloves with appropriate leather protectors, insulating hard hat, safety glasses, and rubber boots.
I like the hard hat concept.
An
What if they
insulating
fall on
hard
you?
hat.
What do they think is going to happen?
Not sure. Then there's a warning at the end of the policy in bold stating, warning, whilst RCDs can and do assist with electric shocks, they are not infallible and care must be taken at all times when using GPO and extension leads. Do not depend solely on the RCDs to protect you.
Agreed. That is important.
Yep.
Defibrillators and EpiPens are also said to have been introduced to the vessels.
Excellent. So I just quickly looked, and so there is a whole page about residual current devices for the Australian Maritime Safety Authority now.
Yeah.
Every vessel must have one for every socket, and that they have to be inspected by an electrician every 12 months.
Yep.
And then they need testing every 3 months by personnel on the vessels.
Okay. Rather than every once a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is in the policy for these vessels now. So in his final remarks, the coroner noted that the death of Ryan was needless and tragic and could have been prevented if there was compliance with the law. I think his exact words were a modicum of compliance with the law.
Ooh.
Oh.
He noted that it was clear that the previous recommendations of the WA coroner had no impact, which of itself is scandalous.
Oh.
Each of these recommendations was appropriate, and if they had been taken seriously, would have prevented Ryan's death.
Yeah, and that's a tough one because people aren't like us. They don't sit around reading them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's then on like the regulator to really make sure that it's distributed appropriately.
Absolutely.
And it's also on the coroner to make sure it gets distributed to the regulator so the regulator knows that it happened, so that the regulator can then encourage people to then maintain their requirements.
Yes, absolutely. Again, this is from the coroner's words that I'm reading this out. The New Fish One was an unsafe workplace, as conceded by its owner. The failure of the regulatory authorities to respond to Ryan's death is unacceptable.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree with that statement.
On to the recommendations. The coroner stated that I recommend that both the Maritime Safety Authorities and the Work Health and Safety Authorities revisit the recommendations of the Western Australian coroner with a view to ensuring that persons conducting a business or undertaking on domestic commercial vessels well understand the law and their duties to their employees and others. I recommend that those same authorities conduct inspections of domestic commercial vessels and require certificates from electricians where necessary to ensure compliance with the requirements of work health and safety duties and legislation. I have no doubt, unless that is done, there will be more needless and preventable deaths of young men and women on domestic commercial vessels.
Wow. I mean, it's only happened once in a decade.
But that's still, it's one
still
too
a
many. It was
lot.
two too many. I think also the issue with this is that when something like this happens out on a domestic commercial vessel that's out at sea, like it's very hard to do anything about it because they're just so far away from any help.
True.
So it's like the
risk is
higher.
so much higher. Yeah, fair. Okay.
Yeah. I recommend the Australian Maritime Safety Authority take the lead in ensuring that all legal requirements and duties of the workplace are communicated through the mechanisms of maritime safety, and in particular the message that domestic commercial vessels are workplaces and require all general purpose outlets to be protected by residual current devices.
Yep.
He also states that I believe that offences may have been committed in connection with the death of Ryan Donoghue, and in accordance with section 35(3), I report my belief to the Commissioner of Police and the Director of Public Prosecutions.
Wow.
Ooh.
Okay.
I also refer the matter to NT WorkSafe for their further and better consideration.
Ooh.
Oh, yeah?
Gosh.
So I did do a little bit of Googling after this, and I did find a news article from May 2017. So this coroner's report was in late 2016, I believe.
Yep.
So May 2017, the charges were made against the company in relation to Ryan's death, but I couldn't find anything after that as to what happened. It may have settled, it may have dropped off.
But
Who
someone
knows?
actually was like, no, you were in the wrong.
Yes, and so I believe this action was taken by NT WorkSafe.
Yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel better now.
Yeah.
It was quite difficult to ascertain exactly, but it did seem that there was at least some consistency that there was duty of care owed and it was not provided.
Yes.
Yep.
That seems fairly black and white to me.
Yes. I find the jurisdictional issues here so bizarre because, as I said, this is an NT coroner's report. The stuff was carried out by Queensland initially. So why did this, or maybe this did go to Queensland initially, the Queensland coroners, and the Queensland coroner was like, this is not mine, this is yours.
Well, but also we have made the assumption that the Queensland coroners tend to be a lot busier because of the density of the population of Queensland. So it also could be that they actually referred back to NT being like, look, this is questionable, but your workload is...
Potentially, but you would assume that if this one was held in Queensland, it'd be held in Cairns, not Brisbane.
Still think that their workload's probably higher. Like, I still think the density of Northern Queensland is higher than the overall state population of Northern Territory. Because Northern Territory does not have a lot of people.
No, but I don't know the jurisdiction of the Cairns coroner, whether it's just Cairns.
Look, I'm glad that the company eventually got some sort of investigation.
Some consequence.
Yeah, so an interesting one. It seems so obvious.
A little bit.
But
yet so complex all at the same time.
Yeah, these RCDs should have been installed on this vessel, and it seems like there was intention, I guess, for them.
Hold up. But there also, I think, here could be a little bit of self-responsibility.
Of course.
Like, I would have expected it to be common sense to not hold an angle grinder electrically connected to a 240-volt in open water that's choppy and risk having waves blown up.
But again, we don't know what the pressures were on these people to get everything packed up. They were junior. They were just doing their job. They didn't know any better. They tried to waterproof it with a plastic bag.
They knew a little bit, but not enough.
And maybe they'd seen the previous mate doing this.
Yeah,
like,
potentially.
for something else. And so they were just going by what they'd seen before.
Yeah, fair. The culture may have been such that you just got it done.
Yeah.
No matter your risk.
Yeah. And the fact that, the RCDs weren't installed, they weren't wearing proper personal protective equipment, and it seems like other people on board knew that they weren't, or at least
could have foreseen
couldn't remember that they weren't. Like, they couldn't remember what they were wearing. Yeah. And yes, so they could have foreseen if they weren't wearing proper PPE that maybe, okay, stop waterproofing the angle grinder with a plastic bag and put on some boots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some gloves. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that sort of contributed to this death. And the coroner, I think, is quite right in saying that it was really just unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like, such an avoidable thing to have happened, especially in light of the previous incident that occurred in WA some 13 years beforehand.
True.
And the fact that all of those recommendations had not been implemented. Yes, they were recommendations sort of towards the WA jurisdiction, but as we've discovered, vessels can go across jurisdictions, and it should have been sort of implemented more widely. And I think the coroner even sort of remarked in this report that he was like very sorry to the family of Mr. Thomas. And the fact that all the recommendations that came out of the report into his death were not implemented, and so basically it could seem to the family that like his death wasn't taken seriously.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.